forgotten. Talk 3. It could be said that the Incarnation did not end with the life of Christ. Rather, it can be understood as a process unfolding through millennia in the lives of thousands, even millions of individuals, many of whom are not affiliated to any religious tradition. The great images of the Christian myth, like the Annunciation, are archetypal realities that can come alive again in our time, because an arduous process of birth is taking place in the collective soul of humanity. We are awakening to what I have called the dream of the cosmos, the dream of an enlightened humanity engaging in a new role on this planet, a role that is in harmony with the evolutionary intention of the cosmos, and is no longer driven by the quest for power, conquest, and control, and the appropriation of the earth's resources for the benefit of the few. As we begin consciously to align ourselves with this luminous ground of reality, our minds will serve the deepest longing of our heart, the deepest wisdom of our soul. We will know who we are and why we are here.
Very nice.
So that's the agenda.
Before breakfast.
This talk, I may need to clear my throat a bit, it's gone a bit croaky. Must be Janice. This talk will look at the legends that suddenly appeared in Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries about the quest for the Holy Grail. The Grail appears variously as a cup, dish, or stone, and vessel as well. Was the Holy Grail Was the Holy Grail the cup of the Last Supper, as has long been thought? Or was it the body of sacred teachings descending from Jesus that have survived through the centuries? Was it a secret Gnostic church that was an alternative to the established Catholic one? What was the vision of the Grail that the knights of the Grail legend so diligently sought and so few experienced? At the beginning of the 12th century, hardly anyone had heard of the Grail. By the end of the 13th century, after this tremendous explosion of mythology, there was hardly anyone in Europe who had not heard of it. The abundant literature about the Holy Grail appeared so suddenly and abruptly in the 12th century that it seems as if it gave literary shape to a well-established oral tradition. Now, I think this is something that could happen now. Because it happened when there was no internet or anything like that, one could start a whole new quest for the Holy Grail, I think. We need troubadours to carry it all over the world. And we need a core new story, which Janice's meeting is talking about. These stories were told and retold in all the European languages, but nothing new was added to them after the mid-13th century. They offered a coded template of knightly virtue and conduct. There is a suggestion in Rudolf Steiner's work that the Grail stories came to the fore in Charlemagne's court at Aachen, and that the later stories were elaborations of these, and I think that's perfectly possible because I have a great love of Charlemagne and his whole period. The Grail legends transformed pagan and Celtic mysteries into the quest for the spiritual life. I'll repeat that. The Grail legends transformed pagan and Celtic mysteries into the quest for the spiritual life. In the 12th century, the cup, chalice, dish or platter, and stone were symbols pointing to the teaching of the hidden Cathar Church of the Holy Spirit that was spreading all over Europe through the troubadours. The courts of love were purportedly instituted by Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived from 1155 until 1240. She lived to be a very old woman, and her daughter, Marie de Champagne. Women exercised an extraordinary powerful influence on manners and culture in the 12th century. The formality and validity of the courtly ideal is to be attributed largely to their influence and to the Grail legends which were widely disseminated in these courts. Through woman, the poet is inspired. To her he turns. By her he desires to be admired and loved. and it is his wish to understand and serve her. The focus is on love at the spiritual rather than the sexual level. The service of woman and the service of love went hand in hand. Courtly love was raised to a spiritual practice. Now this country is much in need of courtly love because the manners are appalling. If you go onto the Twitter, whatever, I mean this coarseness is just appalling. So that's just an idea I'm putting out. Anybody can take it forward. The predominance of the irrational or the interest in it, this is from John Matthews in his book The Grail. The predominance of the irrational or the interest in it distinguishes the feminine as well as the Celtic mentality, legends that have survived to this day. Courtly love has its place in the history of the Grail for several reasons. As a civilizing force, it drew inspiration from women, hitherto virtually ignored in the culture of the Middle Ages. Drawing freely on the sentiments expressed in Arabic poetry and song, as well as on the teachings of the Sufi mystics, whose beliefs included idealized earthly love as a means to spiritual perfection, courtly love placed woman on a pedestal for the first time in that age, worshipped her as a goddess, revered her as an almost sacred object of devotion, and in so doing touched off a spark in the poetic consciousness which resulted in a flood of lyricism and song. You can only do that when you have the activation of the feminine archetype. You can't do it through the masculine archetype alone, because there's no relationship in the masculine archetype. You have to have the feminine for relationship. So the troubadours, singers and poets who celebrated the art of courtly love in all its aspects, and who originated in the southwest of France, as I'll tell you tomorrow, and travelled all over Europe, became a significant influence in Western culture. This is again Matthew's quote from him. Love became a faith to live by, a code second only to that of chivalry, with which it was closely linked. A complex set of laws ruled every act of courtship made by the knight for the love of his lady, who was always portrayed as aloof and cold of heart and lacking in charity, and who humbled her worshipper with cruel words, only spurring him on to greater efforts to please her. Though never classed as a heresy, courtly love was clearly frowned on by the Church. Jung considered that the Grail was the most important mythology of the Western world. He asked his wife Emma to write a book on it, treating it as a story about the individuation or soul growth of the European psyche. Emma and Jung saw the Grail stories as a compensation emerging from the unconscious for what was missing in the Church's teaching, with its emphasis on belief and worship, rather than on the growth of the soul and spiritual transformation. Hence the need for a quest that would carry a numinous fascination for the young men and women of that time. Emma died before she could complete it, and Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's most trusted associate, finished it. That's it. A quote from John Matthews. In the history and beliefs of the Middle Ages, the role played by the Grail shines like a brilliant star. Without disdaining either sublimity or grace, the Arthurian romances produce a sense of wonderment through a feeling of strangeness. This is their style. They carry the reader into a world of the supernatural, where human destiny is liberated from the laws of this world. Strange characters, adventures which get tangled and disentangled in a fog of mystery, obscure magical powers which electrify or else paralyze the will. This is the spectacle usually offered by these stories. These legends take us into the imaginal world, where the psyche creates the images that reflect its deeper life and draws us into it like a fairy tale. Grail legends coincided with the building of the great cathedrals in France, England and Germany, as well as the Crusades. Chartres, like all the great cathedrals in France, was dedicated to the Virgin Mary as Queen of Heaven. Her supreme symbol was the rose, and the great rose windows that adorn the 4 facades of Chartres represented her. The Virgin Mary was associated with the image of the Grail because she was the precious vessel in which the Son of God became manifest. So that's one image of the Grail. The Grail legends also coincided with the pilgrimages to the places sacred to the Black Madonna and the rise of the worship of Mary Magdalene with the building of her magnificent basilica at Vézelay. It is interesting that the medieval church made no reference to the Grail, either for or against its existence. It is possible that it knew the Grail was connected with the attempt to create an alternative church, with the Grail as its central symbol. This is terribly important, I think, for Janice's meeting. If you don't mind me saying so.
No.
There's also this aspect, the astrological aspect, because the Table of the Grail was associated with, and the 12 nights associated with the 12 constellations, so that each night represented a constellation. Rather a beautiful image, that.
Beautiful. Is that sharp?
No, it's Google. I think somebody must have made it and put it onto Google. It's not anything that I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Now I'm coming to the actual authors of the Grail legends. First of all, there was Chrétien de Troyes, who wrote Le Conte del Graal in around 1180 to 90, near the end of the 12th century. And this was the first story about the quest and the wounded king and the procession of women carrying the Grail dish through the hall. He died before he was able to finish the story, but this was the earliest and most influential of all the Grail texts. Now Troyes, unpronounceable name, Troyes was one of the main Templar sites in France, where the group of 4 Templars who went to Jerusalem in the 11th century came from, and to which they returned. They were said to bring back with them a priceless treasure, but no one could say what this treasure was. Was it the teachings of the Gnostic Church, some Gnostic manuscripts, the cup of the Lost Supper, or part of the lost treasure of the Second Temple in Jerusalem that had been sacked by the Romans and that had been hidden beneath the Temple Mount? The second author was Robert de Boron, who wrote a book called Roman de l'Histoire du Graal, of which Joseph d'Arimathie forms the first of 3 parts, the second part being about Merlin, which is mostly lost, and a third section called Percival. In his version, the Grail was firmly identified with the vessel in which Joseph had caught Christ's blood, and becomes the Holy Grail. The blood of Christ was believed to contain the soul and even the divinity of the Saviour, so it carried enormous numinosity. It was believed to carry unlimited powers of healing and was a means of transmitting a direct apprehension of God. In the Christian sacrament, as you know, Christ's body and blood became the bread and the wine. Now, in a work known as the Lancelot Grail, which was an introduction to the story of Joseph of Arimathea by Robert de Boron, there is a passage which shows that the Grail legend was already in existence in 8th century England. This is what it says. On the eve of Good Friday of the year 717, the writer lay in his hut in one of the wildest regions of Britain, plagued with doubts about the Trinity. Then Christ appeared to him and gave him a small book no bigger than the palm of his hand, which would resolve all his doubts. On the following morning the writer opened the book and found that the sections were inscribed with these words: "This is the book of thy descent. Here begins the book of the Holy Grail." I may cry a bit in this, you may too. Here begin the terrors, here begin the marvels. The writer then describes how he was drawn up into the 3rd heaven and of what adventures he had to undergo until the book, which had disappeared, should be found again. Then de Boron starts his actual story of Joseph of Arimathea. And the first part of this story says that Christ's body was given to Joseph of Arimathea for burial. He caught some of his blood in the cup that was used at the Last Supper, either when Jesus was on the cross or in the sepulchre after the crucifixion. After his body disappeared from the sepulchre, Joseph was accused of taking it away and was thrown into prison. Christ appeared to him there in a blaze of glory and entrusted the cup to his care. He was kept alive by a dove, who deposited a wafer in the cup every day. After his release, Joseph gathered his family and other followers and travelled to Glastonbury, where he founded a dynasty of Grail keepers that eventually included Percival. Joseph built the first Christian church there, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. This ties in with the material in Talk 1 about Joseph being a rich merchant who travelled to Cornwall and Somerset and was given land near Glastonbury. Anyway, Joseph and his company travelled further, perhaps to southern France or northern Spain. This is all part of de Boron's story. A temple to house the Grail was built on Mont Salvat, the mountain of salvation. An order of knights comes into being. The keeper of the Grail is wounded in the thighs or the genitals, caused by the spear that pierced Christ on the cross. Henceforth he is known as the maimed or wounded king. The country becomes barren, a wasteland where there is not enough water and a terrible drought. The country is restored to fertility, and the king's wound is finally healed by a knight who asks the question, "What ails thee, father?" So that's all Robert de Boron. Then in 1210 there was the quest del Saint Grail, which completed the transformation from the mysterious object introduced by Chrétien into a fully fledged Christian symbol. Galahad is the main character in this story. He doesn't appear in the other stories. The perfect virgin knight, who is the only one who actually can see the Grail. So he had to be virgin in order to be able to see the vision. Then finally, in 1207, there's Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival. And in this version, the Grail is a stone, not a cup. And it is called the lapis exilas, the exile stone, or stone of exile. Wolfram was the author who made the strongest connection to alchemical symbolism, and I would think to Kabbalah, because Wolfram's stone could possibly be a reference to the Shekinah, who was called the precious stone. I've gone into that a lot in my book. It was said to be an emerald. This could relate to the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus and also to the philosopher's stone of alchemy. Wolfram says that he got the story from a Provençal man called Quiot, who himself had found the story written in a heathen script, probably Arabic script, in Toledo, and had come to the conclusion that the house of Anjou should be regarded as the guardian of the Grail. I haven't read Wolfram von Eschenbach, so I'm only telling you what I've been able to get from reading Matthews and other people. So Parzival in Wolfram's story is descended from the house of Anjou. There were other later compilations that formed the inspiration for Sir Thomas Malory's Le Mort d'Arthur, published in 1485 by Caxton. But those are the main texts, and it was from those texts that the troubadours took the stories all over Europe. Now, the sacred cauldron or cup goes back a long way, and there are innumerable legends about it, both in Europe and in the East, as far as India. In Greece, there are legends of a cup or crater. The cup of Dionysus gave inspiration. In the Eleusinian mysteries, there was a sacred crater or cup known as the Kernos, and whoever drank from it had a vision of a paradisal sphere and immortality, or a glimpse of immortality. Many Celtic legends also told of a sacred cauldron that gave inspiration and rebirth and nourishment for all. The cauldron of the Welsh goddess Ceridwen, who had a semi-divine son called Taliesin, the greatest Welsh poet, who's often associated with Merlin. So all of these images of the cauldron offered a gateway to paradise, or a vision of the place where the cup, vessel or cauldron was to be found. And this is all very deep in the English psyche. It's so deeply buried that it's hard to find. But this man, who I'm going to base my story of Parsifal on, Lindsay Clark, brought it to life about 20 years ago with this and a wonderful series on BBC recorded voice, not on television but on the radio, and also in a book which won the Whitbread Prize. I can't remember the title of it, but it was an alchemical book. And he really regenerated these stories in a wonderful way. He's a wonderful storyteller. So we then have this marvellous chalice from Ireland dating to the 8th century. And look at the incredible workmanship on it at that time. It was very like, actually, the work of Charlemagne's court. It was of that standard. So it was no backwater island. It's one of the most revered treasures in Dublin. And the combination of silver, bronze and gold, coupled with the artistic and technical expertise, were centuries ahead of their time. So now we come to Arthur and the story of the sword in the stone. After the death of Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, the nobles needed to find a new king. Arthur had been hidden away from the time of his birth by Merlin, who had arranged his father's marriage to Igraine, the beautiful wife of Gorlois of Cornwall. Merlin now presented Arthur to the assembled knights, but he was young and untried, and the knights were suspicious. A mysterious stone appeared with a sword thrust into it, and the legend said that whoever was able to draw the sword from the stone would be the rightful king. The young Prince Arthur was able to draw it forth not once but 3 times, and so he was accepted as king and established his court at Caerleon in Wales. And here's a beautiful tapestry of King Arthur, quite early on. At Caerleon there is a round table, and Galahad is allowed to sit in the Siege Perilous without coming to harm. No one else can sit in it because it represented the seat that Judas had sat in at the Last Supper, and was mortally dangerous to whoever sat in it, save only Galahad. One day on the Feast of Pentecost the Grail appeared before the assembled king and queen and knights, veiled and held in a beam of sunlight, and the knights vowed to go in search of it. On their quest, the knights encountered hermits living in the deep woods they passed through on their quest. These guided them on their way. In one version of the quest, only 3 knights succeeded in reaching the Grail. Galahad, the virgin knight who was the son of Sir Launcelot by the daughter of the Grail king. He had slept with her thinking she was Guinevere. He'd been deceived into thinking that Guinevere would meet him in a secret room, and instead he found this woman who was desperately in love with him. And so they conceived Galahad. And the other person who reached the Grail was Percival, the holy fool, and Bors, the ordinary man of the people. But only Galahad actually experienced the vision of it in this version of the story. So here, in this beautiful tapestry by the School of William Morris, is Galahad's vision of the Grail. There's definitely a cup there. And of course the artist, William Morris, and his whole entourage were very inspired by the Grail, and many, many beautiful paintings were done at that time, the 19th century. But I'm going to base this story that I'm going to tell you on the story of Wolfram, because it's been told so beautifully in this book, and so I'm basing it on this, what I've been reading in that book, and telling it to you as it's told by Lindsay Clark. And the principal characters in the story of Parsifal are, first of all, King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, then Parsifal, or Percival, if it's the other pronunciation. Blanchefleur, who's the wife of Parzival. Parzival's mother, Herzegovina, Queen of Wales, and wife of Parzival's father, Gamuret, King of Anjou. Gurnemans, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Herzegovina's Marshal, and Parzival's tutor. The wounded fisher king Anfortas, and his hermit brother, Trevrisent. Finally, Theophes, who's the son of Garumet, and Bellicane, his black African queen. And finally, Réponse de Joie, who is the bearer of the Grail. So there's quite a lot to take in there, but as we go along, I think you'll follow it with me. So, with the story of Parzival, we enter what Henri Corbin, the great Sufi scholar, called the imaginal realm, the realm that is between dreaming and waking, where all intellectual commentary has to be suspended as we deeply experience the story. Parzival's story is one of death and regeneration, following the age-old mysteries connected with the death and regeneration of the crops in ancient cultures, and the myths of Osiris and Tammuz. It is also a story illustrating the alchemical journey through the Negredo and the Albedo to the final illumination of the Rubedo. It is a story that is as relevant for our time as it was for the time in which it was written, for we have not yet set out on the quest for the Grail. The story starts with the kingdom of Anjou in France, where a young man called Gamuret is the second son of King Gandin of Anjou and the brother of Galois, the elder son, who inherited the throne of his father. King Gandin died in a battle, having just mourned the death of his two other sons in battle. So 3 dead men before the story starts. Gamuret, admiring his slain father from childhood, resolves to follow in his father's footsteps and set out into the world to seek adventure and renown, leaving his beloved elder brother Galois as king of Anjou. His mother begged him not to go, for she had already seen her husband slain and her 2 sons for pursuing the same aim. This is the first time in the story we hear of a woman left weeping and bereft by the loss of husband or son. Gamuret had many adventures and ended up at the court of the Caliph of Baghdad, who ruled 2/3 of the known world. After some time spent there, Gamuret decided to return home. It makes me think this could refer to the 9th century, because that was the time when Baghdad was at its peak of power, and the Caliph of Baghdad did rule huge territory then. Anyway, Gamuret decided to return home. On the way there, sailing along the coast of North Africa, he came across a besieged city. He went to its aid, overcame its attackers, and fell in love with Bellicane, the beautiful dark queen who ruled over the kingdom of Zazamank. They married, and for 3 months he was content to stay there. But the old restlessness reasserted itself, and he set off once again for his home in Anjou, leaving behind him only a letter saying goodbye to his wife. 6 months later, she gave birth to their son, whose skin was both black and white, and she named him Feraphes, Veraphes meaning dappled sun. Gamuret arrived, little bit of weeping there, Gamuret arrived in the kingdom of France, where a great tournament was held, at which he outshone all the other knights gathered from the countries of Ireland, Gascony, Aragon, Castile, Portugal, and Germany. Among the throng was the lady Herzegovina, heiress to the kingdom of Wales after the recent death of her father. With her was her marshal, the Lord Gurnemans. Entranced with Gamuret's prowess, she fell in love with him, and overcoming Gamuret's fear that she would try to hold him to her, they were married. 9 months later, a son, Parzival, was born to the queen. Soon, too soon, Gamuret's restlessness reasserted itself, and he begged the queen's permission to leave. "So now you threaten to abandon us, as once you abandoned your heathen paramour. Can't you see," the queen cried, "that I love you more than my life? I can't live without you. I'm terrified that I'll lose you in a stranger's war." 10 weeks later came the news that Gameret, the greatest warrior in Christendom, had been killed on the road to Baghdad. The Caliph sent word that he had been given a glorious funeral in Baghdad and that he would be forever mourned by the Saracens. Herzloid was only with great difficulty prevented from killing herself and her son. Driven out of her mind with grief, she secretly left the castle one night, taking her son Parsifal with her. This is the third time in the story that a wife or mother was abandoned by her husband or son. The despairing queen brought her son up alone in a hut in the forest for 17 years, vowing to keep him safe from the world and protect him from all harm. You'll laugh, but I get identified with my grandson. Because I like to protect him from the world, and of course I can't. So I get drawn into this story. Now wait a minute. Where was I? Here we are. She brought him up alone in a hut in the forest, vowing to keep him safe from the world and protect him from all harm. Wales and Anjou were left without a king because Gameret's brother, the king of Anjou, had also died. Soon both lands were ravaged by war, and that's the wasteland coming into being. One morning Parsifal heard horses and the clash of arms, and saw 5 knights in shining armour breaking into a clearing in the forest. Dazzled by them, he rushed to tell his mother about them, having never seen anything like that before. She recognized that the moment of parting had come, and fainted. She then told him about his father and how he died. Percival showed no interest in what she told him, and said his one desire was to go to King Arthur's court and join the knights. His mother told him that he must help any woman he sees in distress, but that he may only take a kiss from her, no more, although he may take a ring. He left his mother without a backward glance. She later died of grief, without him being aware of his loss. So another death of the mother. Dressed in homespun clothes and smelling of animal pelts, Parsifal set out for the court of King Arthur. On the way there he met a woman who was being, I think he'd rescued her from attack. He kissed her by force and seized an emerald ring from her finger, just like his mother had told him to do. He also saw a red knight carrying a golden goblet. Arrived at the court, he was ridiculed for his appearance and his speech. Probably his smell as well, I should think. He learnt that the Red Knight had stolen the goblet from Arthur and laid claim to his lands. Percival asked Arthur's permission to go after the knight, and with unerring aim killed him with his javelin, bringing the golden goblet back to Arthur and hoping to be knighted there and then. But his appearance and demeanour as a country bumpkin and a fool went against him. Shocked by having killed a man who later turned out to be his kinsman, he put on the knight's armour, and humiliated by the reception he got at the court, he set out at a gallop on the Red Knight's charger into the unknown. Now Arthur and the Round Table represented the highest code of chivalry which prevailed in the Middle Ages. A higher, nobler, and more disciplined man than the warrior was indicated by the term knight. The virtues demanded of him were strength and skill in arms, courage and loyalty to his lord, but also to his friend, and respect for his foe. The Round Table mirrored the developing consciousness of Christian man in the first millennium. The knight's aggressive masculinity was put to the service of a nobler ideal and a higher state of consciousness. The unconscious warrior instinct was being transformed by being put in the service of this higher state. The next stage of Parsifal's journey led him to an encounter with Gurnemanz, his mother's former marshal, to whom he revealed his name. Gurnemanz went on one knee before him, astonished to find that he was the long-lost son of the Lady Herzloid. He invited him to stay with him and be instructed in all the skills and virtues of a knight that he presently lacked, including good table manners and how to treat a woman with respect. After a few months' instruction in both knightly skills with sword and mace, as well as courtly manners and appropriate dress sense, Parsifal hears that the nearby castle of Bel Repaire is under siege, and says he must leave. Before he goes, Gurnemanz impresses on him that he should not ask too many questions, as he had been doing for months and months, because only fools and spies ask questions. So he leaves his elderly and devoted teacher to go out into the world as a fully fledged knight, and comes in the nick of time to the castle of Belrepere, where a beautiful lady, Blanchefleur, was besieged by an unacceptable suitor called Duke Aurelius. Parzival fights a great single-handed combat with the Duke, and reaching the point where he was about to kill him, his hand was stayed by a dishevelled woman who begged him to spare his life. Recognizing her as the woman from whom he had stolen an emerald ring, he admits the wrong he had done her, and so spared the life of the Duke, telling him to return to King Arthur's court. Having lifted the siege and removed the enemy, Parzival has encountered for the first time a woman who is beautiful and desirable, and who is in deep peril. He has fallen deeply in love with her, and she with him. He has not only rescued her, one of the knightly duties, but has also been rewarded with her devotion. Amid great rejoicings they are married. Overcoming his mother's instructions to take only a kiss from a woman, Parzival, at Blanchefleur's amused urging, discovers the deeper pleasures of love. Then, remembering his mother and her grief, but unaware that she has died, he begs Blanchefleur to let him set out to find his mother and bring her to Belrepere to meet his bride. At this point, the story takes on magical elements. Parzival is entering the entranced kingdom of Faerie, so familiar to Celtic poets, the world of the dream. He finds himself in a grim wasteland, not knowing it to be his own kingdom. In the deep fog that covers the land, he has lost all sense of direction, and dropping his reins on his horse's neck, he trusts him to guide him through this wasteland. Trying to find his way back to his mother, he comes to a place where he is blocked by a river and a dead end to the path he is on. He asks God to enable him to find what he is seeking, and through the mist he sees two men in a boat and asks them where he could find shelter. One of them, who is fishing in the lake, points out the way to the mist-shrouded Grail castle, the only shelter for 30 miles around. The fisherman says to him, "My son, thou seest here space and time are one," indicating that he has entered another realm. "And take care, knight, there are paths that will lead you astray in the failing light. Find the right way, and you shall have royal entertainment of me there." Parzival has not found his mother, but has found the way, with the help of the fisherman, to the realm of dreams and visions, the realm of the soul. As he climbs the high ridge of a crag, the light has almost gone. Then a pallid shaft of moonlight gleams through a gap in the shifting clouds, and suddenly a noble castle appears before his tired eyes. Sorry, that needs to go further. He suddenly comes upon the castle of Montsalvat or Montsauvage, announces his name as Parzival of Wales, and finds the gate opens for him as if he were expected. After he has bathed and changed into clothes given to him, he is taken into a great hall lit by a blazing fire and many candles. In the dim light he sees an old man, and Fortas, the fisher king, wrapped in a sable robe, stretched out on a bed near the fireplace, all as if in a dream. The king marvels that he has got there so quickly from the castle of Belrepere. In Wolfram's version, the wounded king and the hermit, who were in the boat and who pointed the way to the castle, are both brothers of Parzival's mother, Hetzeloide. Hence they are his uncles. He is therefore of royal descent both from his father and the house of Anjou, and from his mother. A page enters holding a sword upright in a brightly jewelled scabbard and belt, which he gives to the king, saying it has been sent to him by a niece, to bestow on whom he wishes. The king presents the sword to Parzival, saying that it is an outstandingly rare and precious weapon, and that it is destined for him. Parzival, though longing to ask questions of the king, does not dare speak because of what Gouvernements told him not to do. Large candles light the great hall, which is full of other knights now, and while the Fisher King is speaking to Parsifal, a page carrying a white lance enters and crosses over between the fire and the two men sitting on the couch. From the iron a drop of blood drips onto the tip of the white shaft and flows down the shaft onto the page's hand. A loud cry of lamentation is heard rising from the assembled company. Parsifal notices this but says nothing. Another great door opens, and two more pages enter, carrying many-branched golden candelabra with lighted candles. Wonderful music is heard. A stately procession of 24 maidens enter the hall, wearing exquisite gowns clasped with girdles of gold, their hair garlanded with crowns of flowers. Behind them come two maidens carrying a table made of some rare substance, through which light is shining, which they set down before the crippled fisherman. And then two more maidens followed, bearing platters and knives and a gleaming silver dish. Then another maiden enters the hall, more beautiful than all the others, and dressed in white silk brocade. Her name was Réponse de Joie. On a rich cloth of green silk she carries a grail of pure gold, set with precious stones, and from it streams such a brilliant light that the lustre of the candles is dimmed. She reverently sets down the radiant stone of the Grail on the table in front of the king. Parsifal, stunned by all he is witnessing, still does not dare ask a question. A table is prepared and a great feast served to all the 400 knights present in the hall, and with every course served the Grail passes in front of them, and still Parsifal says nothing, having decided to ask the meaning of all he has witnessed in the morning. The king retires to bed, and Parsifal also retires to the bed prepared for him in the great hall, and sleeps until morning. On waking he finds his armour and weapons lying beside him, but no one to help him arm. The doors giving onto the halls, save the one by which he entered, are all closed, and no one answers his knocking and calling. In the courtyard he finds his horse saddled and ready, and the gate open and the drawbridge lowered. As he crosses it, the bridge is raised while his horse is still on it, so that his horse has to be just able to jump to the land before the drawbridge is completely lifted. As he hears the gates clang shut, Parsifal calls out to the person who raised the bridge, but no one replies, and so he sets out on his way, bewildered and lonely and deeply unsure of himself. He saw no one, but a bitter voice shouted down through the mist rising off the moat, "Do you lack a heart, as you lack a tongue? Could you not have asked the question?" "What question?" Parsifal shouted back. "What question should I have asked?" "Look around you, fool. The hour is lost. The land lies waste. Hope withers with it, and you, who might have aided us, have forfeited the greatest prize of all." Parsifal wondered desperately how he had failed to aid his host. What had he done or not done that he should be cursed like this? Where had his behaviour been wanting, schooled as he had been by Gurnemans, who had told him not to ask questions? Carrying a deep burden of shame, but encouraged by Gawain, a fellow knight that he met on his travels, Parsifal made his way back to King Arthur's court, arriving there on Christmas Day. The king was about to knight Parsifal, addressing him as Parsifal of Wales, rightful king of Anjou and lord of Belrepere, when a loud voice rang out from behind the doors of the great hall. The gates crashed open, and a hideous female rode into the hall. She was dressed in rags and riding a bony mule. Her face was like a boar's snout, with 2 tusks jutting out of it. And before the whole court, Kundry, for that was her name, accused Parsifal of failing to ask the question that would have freed the Fisher King from his pain and lifted the curse from the land. She also accused him of killing his kinsman, the Red Knight, and of causing his mother's death by leaving her. Unaware of either of these, Parsifal could only stand in trembling silence, unable to find any words to defend himself. The king asked Kundry how this grave fault could be mended. "Only," Kundry replied, "if the right man can find his way back to the castle and set this great wrong right." So, despair corroding his heart, Parsifal left the hall, vowing to seek out the Grail castle. For 3 years he wandered in grief and pain, feeling unable, because of his sense of shame, to return to his beloved wife Blanchefleur. Then one night she appeared to him in a dream, reproaching him for not returning to her, and telling him to keep faith with his heart if he wanted to return to the castle of the Grail. He realized that he had lost the simple sense of trust that had once guided him to the castle. Once again, therefore, he let the reins go loose on his horse and allowed him to guide him until, after many days of wandering, he found himself approaching a hut deep in a wood where the hermit Trevisan lived. Haltingly, Parsifal told his sad story, telling him he had vowed not to return to his wife until he had found the Grail castle again. Trevisan tells him the story of the Grail, how, long ago, there was a war in heaven with the hosts of darkness set against the powers of light. But there were some angels who strove to keep the universe together, and who brought the Grail, the stone from heaven, to earth, where it remains under the protection of the Grail guardians. It is the stone of healing, that which has the power to make life whole again. In that stone's pure substance are wedded the virtues both of darkness and of light. Why was the Grail stone lost to us? Parsifal asked him. Trevisan tells him that it was lost because of the fault of his own brother Anfortas, the Fisher King, who forsook his sacred charge as guardian of the Grail in pursuit of a woman he'd fallen desperately in love with. She scorned him, but to win her he fought a great battle with her sworn enemy, and received a terrible wound in his groin. It is a wound that festers with the poisons from the lance and will not heal. His wound cannot heal until one comes to the castle who understands the power of the Grail and can restore it, and for that to happen there is a question that must be asked. There was a knight who came, said Trevisan, but he did not ask the question. Parsifal, deeply shaken, reveals his name, and is even more shaken to learn that Trevisan is his mother's brother, and therefore his uncle. Then he tells Trevisan that he is the knight who failed to ask the question. I was guided there by the rich fisherman himself. He gave me the sword which the Grail-bearer had sent to him. I saw the lance that runs with blood. I sat at the table of the Grail. I felt its radiance, and I ate of its bounty. Yet I did not speak. Trevisan tells him not to give up hope, because the ways of the Grail are mysterious, and he must know that he is the nephew of Anfortas and Réponse de Joie, the bearer of the Grail. Parsifal can't understand why his courage, his knightly virtues, and his renown in battle are not enough to bring him to the Grail castle again. What more does he need? Trevisan answers that he lacks the hardest of all things to acquire, the gentle strength of a mature and compassionate heart. He tells him that he has to accept his darkness as well as his light, and to hold them together as the Grail stone does. He invites him to stay with him a while and meditate on these things until the bitterness and anguish in his heart is dissolved. After some months spent with his uncle in his hermitage in the forest, Parsifal sets out again, and comes to a castle where he meets Gawain again, and Kundry, the witch-like hag who had cursed him. No longer reproaching him, but recognizing the transformation that she sees in him, she takes him up to a high tower, and shows him the lands of the Grail castle stretching out before him, and points out to him a Saracen knight whom she tells him he has to fight. Parsifal says to her, "Dear God, is there no end to fighting?" But goes out to meet the Saracen knight as she's told him to, and to fight him, because she says that he stands between him and the Grail. After a terrific battle, each matched exactly to the other's strength, the Saracen knight let out a great cry, "Zazamank," and lunged at Parsifal, who lost his balance and fell to the ground. The Saracen lifted his scimitar and brought it down with all his force, but Parsifal rolled away and avoided the blow. He sprang to his feet, and at that moment the beloved face of his wife flashed before his eyes, and he shouted her name, Blanchefleur, aloud. Far away, Blanchefleur heard it in her heart, and she reached out to strengthen his. The Saracen had let his concentration slip, and when he lifted his gaze he saw Parsifal's sword descending on his head. Then, to his utter amazement, and Parsifal's as well, the sword shattered into pieces as it crashed against the Saracen's helmet. Knowing that the loss of his sword meant the end was approaching, Parsifal removed his helmet and faced the Saracen knight, asking his name before he faced his death. Then the Saracen sheathed his sword, saying that his name was Ferrefys, Angevin. Parsifal gasped, "But the title of Angevin is mine. By what right do you take that name?" "By a son's right," the Saracen answered. "My father's name is Gamuret the Angevin. Do you know where I can find him?" "Not in this world," answered Parsifal. "My father is dead." Now the Saracen gasped in surprise. "Your father?" They both turned as they heard the voice of Kundry shouting at Ferrefys to take off his helmet. "Show your brother your face," she commanded. As they gazed at each other, they could see that their faces carried the imprint of the father neither had known. "You are both Gamuret's sons," said Kundry, "though by different mothers, both of whom were injured by his pride. Yet the wrong done by the father can be made right by the sons, and in confronting and sparing each other, you have each overcome yourself. The time of the sword is over. It is the Grail that calls you now. I have word from Tervizant at Montsalvage that you, Parsifal, are blessed above all men, for you and your wife have been named to the kingdom of the Grail." Parsifal gazed up at Kundry in a trance of wonder. Then he became aware of his dark brother, Ferrefys, standing with his arms open, waiting to embrace him. They stood for a long time with their arms around each other, their eyes brimming with tears of joy. "Come with me," Parsifal said. "Now that I have found you, I would have you always at my side." Riding together, telling each other the stories of what had happened to them, they came to the shores of a lake, and Parsifal recognized it as the place where he had first seen the Fisher King. Looking up, they could see the ramparts of the castle soaring above them, and to the voice of the sentinel who called down to them, "Who goes there?" Parsifal replied, "I am Parsifal of Wales, Lord of Belrepaire, and son of the Lady Herzeloide by Gamuret the Angevin. I bring with me my dark brother, Ferrefys." "From whom I will not be parted. I would speak with my uncle, the rich fisherman. Then fair welcome to you both. The Grail bids you enter." I'll have to have more practice at reading these things.
That's all right. Good.
Together they were ushered into the presence of the ailing king Amfortas. Parsifal took his withered hand between his own, leaning close to hear what the king wished to say. "If there be any mercy or pity left in this life, bid them keep the Grail from my sight, so that I may have the death I desire." Parsifal, feeling powerless in the presence of the Fisher King's intolerable suffering, lifted his hand to soothe the pain of the wounded man. His own body, trembling with grief, he felt the uselessness of his proven strength and valour in the face of such suffering. He had only compassion to offer the stricken king. In the hushed, attentive silence of the assembled company in the hall, he whispered, "What ails thee, uncle?" And Fortas opened his eyes. His parchment-like skin began to suffuse with colour as the lips of his wound were softly sealed. Outside the castle, the entire land was regenerated, bursting into life once more. Parsifal stood transfixed as the miracle of healing took place before his eyes. At the same moment, the great chamber lit up with the approaching radiance of the Grail. Once again he saw the wonderful procession of maidens bearing the table of the Grail into the hall, and behind them the graceful figure of the Grail-bearer herself, Réponse de Choix, holding between her hands the exquisite chalice in which gleamed the stone. As Parsifal stood in wonder at this vision, the Grail seemed to change until it no longer seemed to be a heart, but the soft protective chamber of a womb, and then into a glassy vessel where he saw the figure of a knight standing with his lady reflected. When he turned away from the vision, his heart overflowed with joy, for there by his side stood his beloved wife Blanchefleur. Taking his hand in hers, she whispered, "Welcome home, my Parsifal." And in reply he whispered, "Blanchefleur, my conduire amour, my love." Fairfils was not excluded from the vision of the Grail, and found his love in Réponse de Joie, to whom he was married in great joy. So, this magnificent story anticipates our time, this precious time of humanity's awakening. Once before in the 12th century this was attempted in the spiritual impulse of the quest for the Holy Grail. The mystery of the Holy Grail infuses the Middle Ages with the image of the age-old quest which turns inward, following the yearning of the seeker's heart, seeking a path that cannot be taught but only found, and is unique for each individual. The chalice, vessel, cup and stone that are the primary images of the Grail evoke the archetype of the feminine, which becomes the inspiration, guide and goal of the knight's inner quest. What is the Grail then but the inexhaustible vessel, the source of life continuously flowing into being, radiating into this world from the unseen realm of the soul, the realm in which all our lives are embedded? And who are the knights who act as guardians of the Grail, but those who faithfully keep alive through the darkened centuries the mysteries of the soul's awakening? The whole story has the feeling of a dream, an initiation dream. Parsifal encounters in the king a higher state of consciousness, not available to him because he is unable to respond with his heart to the suffering king by asking the question that would both set the king free and open his heart to a new and deeper understanding. Parsifal prefigures the dilemma of our age, which is unable to ask the question of itself that could transform it. The last talk tomorrow will explain why the Grail was lost, why the feminine was raped and dishonoured, and why the Albigensian Crusade was the outcome of what had not been integrated within the northern male psyche. The barbarism and brutality of that crusade caused the male psyche to regress, to lose the noble vision of the Grail quest. In the Jungian sense, Parsifal or Percival and Lancelot are two of the most inspiring animus figures of the Middle Ages. They are both saviour figures of whom Christ was the prototype. Both embarked on a spiritual quest which involved the loss of everything held dear to man at that time: power, fame, honour, knightly prowess, mother and wife. Parsifal had to heal the Fisher King and restore fertility to the wasteland. Lancelot, in the story of the Knight of the Cart, had to rescue the Queen, symbol of the soul. They both had to overcome the fear of death and being shamed by their culture, and they both had to learn a different view of woman as initiator of the mysteries. They each went through a profound experience of transformation, requiring a gradual surrender of the earthly personality or persona in exchange for the boon of a higher spiritual nature and the summum bonum of the experience of immortality. So there you have it. What a story.